As we get ready to get into this subject of biblical manhood, let me just give a little bit of an introduction to this and say, first of all, originally when I was like, hey, we haven't done a deeper event in a while, we should do one of these again. I was trying to think of subjects that I feel like, well, what would be timely for what's going on in our culture right now and questions coming up. And I said, I should do a deeper event on biblical manhood and womanhood. And then I was like, I should do two deeper events. One deeper event on biblical manhood and one deeper event on biblical womanhood, because that just gives some more room to kind of dig into this stuff. So in some ways, this is part one of two. We don't have the date exactly nailed down, but probably sometime in May, we'll do a complement event for this and talk about biblical womanhood. I know for some, even in here, it was a little confusing. You were like, is this for women also? Is this just for men? So I'm glad to see a lot of women here. You got the message. This is for everybody. I'm glad to see a lot of young men here. I think that this is valuable for all of us, but especially as you're at the point of sort of trying to figure out, all right, what are the things I want to embrace and lean into, and what are the things that I want to cast off and avoid. That's beneficial for us to talk about. I'm glad to see a lot of moms and grandmas in here. Why is it? We're all involved in this project. When we're looking to live out biblical manhood and womanhood, we're all involved in this project together. So there will be a lot of times that I'm talking more to the men, but then there will be other times that I sort of stop and am trying to inform us all. This is part of how God made us, and it's good for all of us to know. And there may be some other times that I stop and specifically to moms of boys may say, here's something to really tuck away. Here's something to really think about as you're looking to enforce and sort of reinforce strong biblical manhood in young men, and even in husbands and fathers and in everybody. So here's how I want to start off. You have, for most of your sheet that you have here, for the little handout, you have just scripture passages or main points, and we'll kind of fill those in. I will be using slides up here for you to be able to see the things that we'll talk about. But first I have one of these fill in the blanks. And I don't know if you're like me. A lot of times when I get something like this, I start trying to guess what's going to be said. What are these two things that are going to fill in here? But I want this to be sort of an overarching statement about what we'll talk about. And there would be a similar one if we were talking about biblical womanhood. But the answer is this. Biblical manhood is both an identity and an aspiration. And here's what I mean by this. What I mean by this is, first and foremost, if you are male, you are a man. That's how God created you. That's part of your identity. It's not the most true thing about you, but it's near the core. If we're thinking about our lives as men and women, and we're saying, all right, what is the most true thing about us? We could go as deep as saying we are image bearers of the living God. That is the most true thing about any person, man or woman, Christian or non-Christian. You are an image bearer of the living God. And then as believers in Jesus, going right on top of that, we would say, I am adopted into the family of God. I am a child of God. So I'm an image bearer. That's what we share with all humanity. I'm a child of God. That's what we share with all Christians, men and women. And then I would argue third is I'm a man or I'm a woman. It's that close to the core. So on the one hand, if you're male, all right, that's just part of your identity. But also, I think it's okay for us to talk about manhood or masculinity, or even, this is sort of a word that's gone out of style, but even manliness, as something that is an aspiration, as something that we're shooting for. There are certain phrases that have gone out of style. Like there have been a lot of people that have tried to take the phrase man up out of our vocabulary. They're sort of like, what do you mean man up? Or what do you mean be a man? If somebody's a man, then they are a man. So if you say he's not acting like a man, well, he's a man and he's acting that way. So he is acting like a man. So who are you to decide what it's like to be a man or not to be a man? But I just want to say, we do this in all kinds of things in our lives. We might say to one another, hey, be an adult. Be a grown-up. And if somebody's acting in a bad way, they could say, hey, I am a grown-up, and this is how I am acting, so I am acting like a grown-up. But we'd all know, no, there are certain things that are involved in this that you should behave. There are certain behaviors that should be a part of this. Hey, be the adult in this room. There's something appropriate about us saying, we are men, and then we act like men. There's an aspirational sense of this. It'll be the same way with womanhood when we talk about that in a few months. So I want to say that just from the outset, that's part of my grid. If you're coming into this saying, I'm not sure that's the right grid, the Q&A time is perfect. You can push back, you can ask questions, you can try to kind of poke holes and see if there's something more to be covered. But I'm approaching this from the standpoint of, hey, there's a certain identity as men and women that we embrace, but there also is an aspiration that we say, I can act more like the man that God has called me to be, or I can act less like the man that God has called me to be. And so what I want to do now for this first session is going to be sort of heavy on just going through the biblical story. And the second session, we're going to cover a lot of scripture, but it's going to be more practical, just sort of how do we live this out? So for this first section, I'm taking on the question of, is there a unique calling for men in scripture? Because when we start with this question, we could say the vast majority of commands and directions in the Bible are just for all of us. They're not specifically to men or specifically to women. They're just for all of us. When you read through the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, there's no like, well, this Beatitude is for men and this one is for women. They're just all for all of us. When you read through the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians chapter 5, it's not that some of those are masculine qualities and some are feminine qualities. Those are for all of us. So the vast majority of the Bible is just speaking to all of us as human beings. This is what God is calling us to do. But I do want to zero in on parts of Scripture that zero in on men and to seem to speak to men, not just everyone, not men and women, but specifically to men. And I want to start all the way back. John, where are you going? I said, if I know your name. I want to go all the way back to the beginning and start with Genesis 3. Because I think in some ways you could go back to Genesis 2. You see distinctions between men and women in Genesis 2 and the fact that Adam is created first and then Eve is created from him and the whole idea of the helper. And I may refer to some of that, but Genesis 3 is where I think we first see a really strong indication of distinctness between male and female. And it comes after the fall. And so I'll put it up here on the screen so you can see verse, do I have this on? Yeah, so you can see. Oh, we got the questions. This is what the guys were working on. Actually, I'll pause on this right now. Anybody that thinks at some point I may want to ask a question, just go ahead and take a moment down right now and write down this number. And that way, if I see you with your phone out, I'm going to believe that you're not playing a game. There's no football scores to check. So, I'm not worried about that. But if at any point you're like, oh, okay, I know what I want to ask, I'm just going to go ahead and do that now. You can text out that question. Oh, good, they made it real big now. I was about to read it, but they made it even bigger. 909-863-8122. Anybody want me to still hold that there? Everybody got it? All right, we'll go on then. Let's see. All right, we'll move on. Mankind and the fall. So here's where we are. I'm going to read what God said to Adam after the fall, after the sin that Adam and Eve committed. I'll start at verse 17, which is up on the screen. I may read the verses after it. But it says, to Adam he said, because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. Now, this might feel like a strange verse to highlight, but here's why I'm highlighting this. After Adam and Eve fell, after they sinned against God, there was a threefold curse that God gave in Genesis 3. It starts with the serpent. He curses the serpent who tempted Eve, and there's kind of shame and disgust going around with the serpent. You're going to crawl around on your belly. You're going to be the most despised of all animals. So he curses the serpent. Then there's a curse that goes to the woman. And there's a little bit of debate on this, but it seems to come kind of in two fronts. She's going to have pain in childbirth. So one of the most beautiful things about womanhood is going to be associated with pain and grief. And then God says, your desire will be for your husband, but he will rule over you. Which in shorthand, I think what he's saying is there's going to be friction between the sexes. You are going to want to control your husband, which will be a bad way of handling things. He's going to want to dominate you in response to that, which will be a bad way of handling things. So instead of there being this harmonious thing between men and women, there's going to be more friction between men and women. So there's a curse that goes to the serpent. That's just for the serpent. There's a curse that goes to the woman, and that's for all women. Look again at the curse that goes to the man. It's not just to Adam, and it's not just to all men. It's to the entire creation. He doesn't say, cursed are you, or cursed are all males. He says, cursed is the ground because of you. Work is going to be frustrating. Creation is not going to work the way that it's supposed to work. This is so striking. There's a disproportionate weight and a disproportionate fault that is placed on Adam, at least disproportionate in terms of men and women being equal, and this seeming like, wow, for the serpent, serpents just got punished. For the woman, women just got punished. For the man, all of creation experiences consequences. And in case you think that I'm reading too much into this, we can see this in the New Testament also. Romans chapter 5, you could go back later and read kind of more in Romans chapter 5. But Romans chapter 5, verse 14 is what I have up on the screen. And I'm gonna pull it up on here just so that I'm not having to look back the entire time. But what Paul is doing in Romans chapter 5 is he's drawing a parallel between the fall of Adam and what Jesus came to do. So in verse 14, he says, "Nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking a command, as did Adam, who is a pattern of the one to come." So follow this. If you're not seeing why I'm bringing this up, just kind of follow this trajectory for a minute. Paul is drawing a parallel. He's saying in Adam, we all fell. The problem, sin came into the world. And through Christ, in his act of obedience, we all have the opportunity to rise. When we get into that idea that through Adam we all fell, who is absent from this? Yeah, Eve is absent from this. And in some ways, it might be like, sexist. But it's like, women, do you really want to be a part of this right now? Like, this is not good. This is not leaving out Eve because Eve would say, hey, I want my name up there. You fell because of me also. It wasn't just Adam. In fact, it was my idea. I gave him the fruit. It's striking that you could look back on it and you could say, well, she's actually the one that ate first. And it appears to be her idea to some degree, and yet the full weight and responsibility of this comes on Adam. In fact, if you go back to the Genesis 3 verse 17 passage, it says, the first thing that God says to him is, because you listen to the voice of your wife. Now, men, don't absolutize this. You're like, I know, this is how men always get into trouble, by listening to their wives. That's not what's going on, but it is striking. When he says that, the problem is not that he's saying you should never listen to your wife. The problem he's saying is you chose to listen to your wife instead of listening to God, which is the problem for almost all of our sins in many ways, that we choose to listen to somebody else and instead of choosing to listen to God. I like to say with Adam, he's not the last, but he was the first man to do something stupid because a pretty girl wanted him to. You go all the way back here, and the main point of all of this is that Adam abdicated. Adam had the primary responsibility, and so the primary fault falls on him. So just even through the story of the fall, we should look at that and say, it doesn't seem that men and women, that the differences between us are just flattened. It seems like there are different ways that we interact in the world, going all the way back to the idea that they both ate, but there is different consequences from all of this. Now, if the only sort of proof that I had of this greater weight of responsibility, of sort of leadership and responsibility of men was Genesis 3 and Romans 5, you might think, all right, that's probably reading too much into it. But let's just survey how God set up the nation of Israel to see if this continues to be the story of Scripture. So we'll look at the story of Israel, and I'm not going to put up passages for all of this. I'll allude to some different things, but I want to just put this up. 4 elements. You have this in your handouts. 4 elements of life in Israel. Israel was by no stretch of the imagination a perfect nation, and at the same time, we do get a view into saying, well, God chose to set up this nation. It doesn't mean everything that happened was good, but it means we can look at it and say, well, God chose to set it up this way. So we'll talk about family, we'll talk about religion, we'll talk about war, and we'll talk about ruling. So in family, a big word that is part of our culture now is patriarchy. Sort of end the patriarchy, which is this broad idea of talking about sort of male rule in our culture and trying to bring that down. But if you read the Old Testament, you have actual patriarchy, which just means men sort of as the ones leading the way. You go back to Abraham, you have Isaac, you have Jacob. Now, when you have those 3, you certainly have the women playing a huge role in it. You have Abraham and Sarah, and you have Isaac and Rebekah, and you have Jacob and a whole bunch of women, Leah and Rachel and the concubines and all of them. And yet at the same time, the way that things are functioning, it's not even sort of explicitly laid out. The men are the leaders of the tribe. The men are the leaders of the family. The closest you would get to sort of a prescription of this might be in 1 Peter 3, when Peter is speaking to wives and he refers back to Sarah and says, Sarah obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. But really what you have is just sort of the example. This is the way that things flow out in family life. Now, if we go further, if we go into the religious sphere of the life of Israel, the thing that we would have absolutely most clearly is that the only priests in Israel are men. Now, most men are not eligible to be priests because you have to be a Levite to be a priest, but only men are priests. On top of that, there are exceptions to this, but the vast majority of prophets in Israel were men. And it's interesting because when we get to the exceptions of this, it almost ends up being the exception that proves the rule. We're like, wow, there's a woman prophet. That's amazing. Because typically the prophets were the men speaking the word of God to Israel. So we could say, all right, it's not absolute. You did have women who are prophets. They're involved in prophetic ministry. But certainly the norm that you would see is the men are the leaders in the religious life of Israel. Only men are priests. And for the most part, the men are the prophets. Then you get into war. There were no women warriors in Israel. The men went to battle. This is actually one of the, I don't know if it's funny, but a little bit funny, the way that right now in our culture we're sort of re-looking back at the way history has been up to this point. And there's a sort of view of history that seems to be largely prevailing right now. And the view of history seems to be like, until right about now, the relationship between men and women had been a very antagonistic relationship. Sort of like women were always abused and men were always getting the best end of the deal. I think that this is a very bad retelling of history. I think the real test of history is that, for the most part, we were all living difficult lives in different ways. Women were living difficult lives and men were living difficult lives. And one of the ways that men lived difficult lives is that men went to war. So the vast majority of war casualties are men. In fact, this is one of the interesting things because this sort of crosses over into the next section, which is the ruling idea of kings in Israel. In the time before there were kings of Israel, there's a book called Judges. Anybody just love the book of Judges? It's like the most edifying book in the Bible. It's a dirty, grimy book with all kinds of sin and dysfunction happening. But if you're familiar with the book of Judges, you know that there was one woman judge. What's her name? Yeah, Deborah. And it's funny in some ways because not only is she the one woman judge in there, she's the only judge that seems to have nothing shady about her. It's like you have Samson. Samson's a mess. You have Gideon. There's all kinds of weird stuff happening with him. You have Jephthah. He sacrifices his daughter. It's just a messed up book. You have Deborah. There's nothing bad said about her. She's the one judge that sort of gets off with a clean record. And yet if you read Judges 4 and 5, it's striking. In some ways, what's striking about Deborah is just how different it looks when she is a judge. And one of the ways that it looks very different is that every other judge was a military leader. Deborah was not a military leader. There was a man named Barak who ended up leading Israel to war in the time of Deborah. And one of the most striking things about the story is that Deborah goes to Barak and she says, all right, God's going to give us the victory. You go lead the army out there. And Barak says, I'm not doing it unless you come with us. And Deborah's response is she says, sure, I'll go with you. But because I'm going with you, you're not going to get the glory in the battle. A woman is going to get the glory in the battle. And if you know how the story unfolds, a woman does get the glory in the battle because the king of the Canaanites ends up fleeing to a tent and getting killed in a particularly brutal way by a woman who uses a hammer and a tent peg. Yeah, if you haven't read the Bible, you're like, I need to read this book. This is craziness. The reason I bring this up is to first of all say, all right, fair enough that there are exceptions sometimes to what we see as the norm here. But I think one of the striking things about Deborah is that the exception sort of reinforces the norm. To say, all right, there was this woman judge. She was probably the godliest of all the judges. And yet the way that she handled it was so different than the way that the men handled it, that in a way it reinforces this idea that God has something unique for men and women in all of this. And then this already kind of crossed over into the ruling. But when Israel had a monarchy, when Israel had kings, and it may kind of go along with the word king, they were all kings, except for one. And this is one of the funny things is that there are people that are more egalitarian that say, no, that there was a woman, that there was a queen in Israel. Her name is Athaliah, and you can read her story in 2 Kings. And it's true. Let me tell you the story of Athaliah. Her son, some of you know, her son was the king, and he was killed. And when she saw that her son, Ahaziah, was killed, she killed all of Ahaziah's sons so that she could be the ruler. Now, a nurse stole away one of Ahaziah's sons, and he came back later, and he became king, and they ended up putting Athaliah to death. Here's my point in this. Yes, she was a queen in Israel. It is by no stretch of the imagination a model situation. It wasn't something where God was like, here's what I'm going to do. This was a violent usurper who ended up on the throne. And so once again, what you can't do with this, with what I'm doing right now, is you can't say, God gave explicit commands on all of these things that men were going to be taking the lead. On some of them you do, with the priests you do, but what you do end up with in here is say, all right, we have this consistent model that you just can't deny. And the consistent model is that there's certain areas of life where the men are expected or commanded to step forward and take an outsized sense of leadership and responsibility. Carries over into the home, carries over into the religious life of Israel, carries over into sort of civic life, and it certainly carries over into the military and sort of the dangerous jobs that the Israelites would have. So we've got that from Israel, but then Jesus came. So let's talk about the church. Let's not stay in Old Testament Israel. We're in New Testament now. Once again, if you have a question, we have it up there. Are we going back to the beginning now? Okay. Sorry, I skipped a whole bunch because I pressed the forward button a bunch. That's where we are. All right, manhood in the Church of Jesus Christ. So Jesus came. So let's ask the question. Because Jesus certainly changed things. Things are different because Jesus changed. And so we could say, all right, was that just Old Testament? And now things are very different because Jesus came and he sort of turned everything on its head. Well, let's talk about the church just in three key areas where we get some insight into this. Jesus, and this came through. If you were here this morning, getting to go through the genealogy, you saw that even through the genealogy of Jesus, women are highlighted in a way that would have been surprising to first century culture. And through the Gospels, this continues to happen. Women show up in spaces in the Gospels that people would have been surprised by. And some of you even know women were the first witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus, which they talk about this with the shepherds also. Shepherds were sort of the first witnesses to the birth of Jesus, and shepherds didn't get to testify in court because they were thought to be sort of shady, uneducated guys. Women were the first witnesses to the resurrection, which is striking also because women's testimony was not typically taken seriously in court. It was like, oh, those emotional women, they probably just imagined the whole thing. Which it's striking that the gospel writers, all four of them, include and testify the fact that it was women, which just goes to show probably the historicity of the gospel, because if they were trying to prove it, they wouldn't have made that up. They wouldn't have said it's a bunch of women. But God graces women with real significant roles. Even when you have the story of Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus instead of being shamed and saying, you should get back in the kitchen, the idea that she's affirmed in that. So there's all kinds of affirmations. You can't really read the story of Jesus and say, well, Jesus just didn't like women. There's no way to read the Jesus story and come away with that. And at the same time, when it came time for Jesus to choose the 12 apostles, they all had something in common. They were all Jewish. Many were fishermen, but they were all men. There were 12 men. And you think, gosh, what a prime example. If Jesus at this point was saying, you know what, we have been sexist for centuries. This has just been silly. Why didn't we have any women priests? Why didn't we have any women ruling over here? Why do we have wives submitting to their husbands? We need to turn this whole thing on their head. It would have been really, really easy. I mean, he doesn't even need to go 6 and 6 here. If he just went 10 and 2, it would have really thrown things off. And we would have said, what do we do with this? But Jesus, who is incredibly positive towards women, chooses 12 men. And when one of the men, when Judas needs to be replaced in the book of Acts, they replace him with another man. And then we go on to elders in the church. And I'll just put a couple passages up here at some different points. The two passages that really affirm what elders are meant to do are 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1. By the way, for guys in here, for any of us as guys saying, all right, if I really want to look at what God is calling me to as a man, 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, the qualifications for elders, is a great place to look. Not every man in here is going to be an elder. Some of you will, some of you in here are. But the elder qualifications, the only one that sort of is a skill issue is the able to teach. Everything else in there should be the aspiration of every one of us as men. We want to be a church where whether or not we're serving as elders, we are all striving to be elder qualified. And some of you, I'm looking around, some of you are future elders in here. You might not know it yet, but God's going to do that work. But right off the bat, in both of the passages about elders, you have 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2. Now the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife. The literal rendering in both this and in Titus is one woman man. Now you could sort of make the argument of like, well, is he saying that? But really it could be sort of a man or a woman, and he's just sort of is using the generic one woman man, but he could reverse that and have it be a one man woman that could be a part of that too. And I say probably not for a few reasons. First of all, he just doesn't say that. Secondly, we don't see any examples in the New Testament of female elders. And thirdly, because in 1 Timothy, he gives the qualifications for elders, and then he gives qualifications for deacons. Now, people debate this point about the deacons, but there's a verse right in the middle of the qualifications for deacons where there's a message to the women. And people debate, well, is that a message to the wives of the deacons, or is that a message to women who are deacons? And it really could go either way. I think, and the position that we've taken as a church is that is a message to female deacons, because all of the descriptions of deacons seem to include the idea that women can be a part of that ministry. And from pretty early in church history, you see that happening. Even at churches that had no women as sort of overseers or elders, they would have women as deacons. So here's why I bring this up. He talks about deacons, and he's like, yeah, and to the female deacons. He doesn't do that with elders at any point. So when the church is being set up, we got 12 apostles who are all men. Jesus is setting that up. And then when it comes to the elders, the qualifications for elders involve being a one-woman man, and it's hard to be a one-woman man if you're not a man. By the way, being a one-woman man does not mean that you have to be married. You could be single, you could be widowed. The idea is that you have a history of faithfulness to your wife, that you're not a womanizer, that you're not a flirt. So we have that right away. All right, so we have the 12 apostles are all men. We have the elders are all men. We get into, I want to talk about a couple passages now just under this heading of church life, that there are a few passages that I think do something really cool in just highlighting the idea of men's unique role within the church. And the main one I'm going to put up here is 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8. And in a moment, I'll put up verse 9 to show the contrast here. Paul takes a moment here in 1 Timothy to speak specifically to men and then specifically to women. So this doesn't happen a lot in the Bible. Anytime it happens, it's something that we can say, all right, here is an instruction specifically for the men. Now, it's specifically for the men in that time, in that context, but still, we can take something from it. So what does he say to the men? He says, therefore, I want men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. Now, quick question. Do you feel like this could appropriately be applied to women also? It certainly seems like it could. It seems like Paul, we could look at this and we could say, well, does Paul want women everywhere to pray? Yeah, lots of indications. We would have to go with that. Does he want them to lift up holy hands without anger and disputing? So yeah, there'd be no reason to think that that's not the case. And yet here, when he's talking about church life, and 1 Timothy is all about church life. This is not about private prayer. This is about corporate prayer when the church is together. He says, here's what I want to happen. I want the men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. Here's what I think is almost certainly going on here. Paul is highlighting something that the men need to focus on so that they don't fall into a dysfunction. And the reason why I think this is the case is because right afterwards, he does something similar where he highlights something in women. Verse 9, he says, I also want the women to dress modestly. And then he goes on to talk about the women dressing modestly. And for the most part, it's not clear that it's mostly that they're dressing provocatively sexually. It's more that they're dressing in very showy ways to get attention on themselves. Now, can men dress in showy ways to get attention on themselves? Yes. Yeah. All right, some of you are yes. Some of the women are like, I'm not sure. Like, I've heard tales, but I've never seen it happen. It's not that it couldn't happen. It doesn't usually happen. It's not, you wouldn't get together with a group of men and just say, all right, men, we got to do business and talk about our dysfunctions. Hey, men, one of our main dysfunctions is that we dress in showy ways that get the attention off God and onto us. For most men, we just sort of open our closets and we're like, this is clean, this doesn't smell bad, I'm going to put this on. We have lots of dysfunctions. For most of us, one of our dysfunctions is not that we're going to dress in a way to try to get all of our attention on ourselves. Sometimes people, Karina laughs at me when I do this. on Saturday nights when I'm deciding what I'm going to wear on Sunday, I go on our LBF Church app. Some of you know where this is going. And I look at what shirt I wore the last few weeks because I don't remember. And I don't want it to show up like 6 weeks in a row of sermons, just the thumbnail, and I'm always wearing the same shirt. Because I know there's 6 days in between, but I'm still like, no, I got to mix it up a little bit. So last night, Karina was like, do you need anything ironed? And I was like, I don't know. Let me find out real quick. So here's the point. It's not, when he's talking to the women about dressing modestly, it's not that it's impossible that a man would need to be told this, but he's zeroing in on the women and saying, hey, this is a temptation. Because of the beauty that women have, and because part of that beauty ends up sort of being adorning yourselves with makeup and with jewelry and with pretty clothes, so this could be a tendency. This could be a danger that you could fall into, that you could dress in a way where attention is being drawn to your beauty and it's getting the attention away from God. With men, he says, all right, there's a way that you could screw this whole thing up to. And the way that you're more likely to screw this whole thing up is to have your personal conflicts keep you from having harmonious prayer in the body of Christ. That when it comes time to pray, instead of us saying we're all joining together in prayer, we're like, well, I'm not holding his hand. I'm not standing next to him. We're not good with each other. It's not that women don't fight with each other, but for men, we can kind of be looking for a fight sometimes. We can get into conflict, and we can get into conflict that ruins our relationships with each other. So Paul says, all right, here's the deal. Anger is something men and women struggle with, but anger tends to be sort of a strong male dysfunction. When we're talking on Wednesday nights with the men's Bible study, it's like we can give other illustrations, but really for the most part, when we're talking about our issues, we're talking about lust and we're talking about anger. If you're a man in here and you're thinking of what are my besetting sins, it's probably lust or anger, or it's lust and anger. You might have something else mixed in there, and if you do, I'm sorry. But most of us, it's like those are the issues that are primary that we deal with. So Paul is zeroing in and he's saying, all right, men, here's what you need to do. When it comes to the ministry of the church, when it comes to church life, you need to be on the lookout. You need to be working extra hard to quash your conflicts with others, because that not only messes up your personal relationship, that messes up the whole dynamic of the church. As men, there's a sense, and we'll talk about this later, there's a good sense in which God has made us to be fighters in appropriate settings, but there's inappropriate settings for that to come out. And he wants to tell us, all right, you've got to get that under control. And so while you could look at verse 8 and say, well, that could be for the women also, he's zeroing in on a specific dysfunction of men. All right, yeah, I'm going to touch briefly on another passage. I don't have it up here on the screen, but I'll just touch briefly. Another passage that in some ways talks about church life, although in a way that we have to work a little bit harder to sort of apply it to right now, is 1 Corinthians chapter 11. So this might be homework later if you're like, I want to dig more into more of this stuff that even in a deeper event we still didn't have time to cover. 1 Corinthians 11 is the head coverings passage, if you're familiar with that. It's very confusing. I'll give you the real short version. The real short version is that what seems to be going on in this passage is that head coverings were a normal way of differentiating masculinity and femininity in Corinthian culture. Everybody knew it. So if a woman wasn't wearing a head covering in the public setting, it was sort of her like casting off femininity. And if a man was wearing a head covering, it was sort of him taking on a feminine persona. The Corinthians all knew this, and so Paul is calling them to basically live out your roles as men. The men should be acting like men, the women should be acting like women in this setting. And so the only reason that I bring this up is that Paul is looking at confusion over masculinity and femininity as a threat to the order of the church. And so this doesn't mean we don't believe that head coverings are something that's perpetual. If you want to hear more on this and you're on YouTube, you can look at Mike Winger's 6-hour episode on head coverings. I'm not even kidding. It's fascinating. I listened to all 6 hours of it. Some of you are like, I will never do this, but some of you will. It's really fascinating stuff. The point is not to say, all right, starting next week, all women are wearing head coverings. But what it does mean is that as we approach life as a church, we embrace that there's a uniqueness to masculinity and a uniqueness to femininity. We celebrate that. We play that up. We don't play that down. And by the way, just before going on to the last section before our break, I do want to say this. Every church, including ours, has dysfunctions and things that we need to get through. I just want to say I'm very thankful because in the midst of a very chaotic culture on these issues, I feel like our church has a positive attitude towards these things that our culture mostly doesn't. I feel like we have really tried to cultivate an atmosphere where we're honoring women as women, and we see a wonderful, unique role that women play in the world and in the church and in our families, and that we have a wonderful way. We're not bashing men, that we have a wonderful way of seeing the role that men play in the world and in our church and in our homes. And that's what Paul, I think, is going for in 1 Corinthians 11. All right, last section before the break, we'll briefly talk about manhood in marriage. And hopefully what you're seeing, hopefully what I want you to see through sort of this cumulative idea is that we get this consistent thread in Scripture. Sometimes we get to a passage like wives submit to husbands, or 1 Timothy 2, I don't permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. And because we're living in 2023 in Southern California, we get to that part and we're just sort of like, we're very unsettled. We're like, oh my gosh, where did that come from? That's so out of nowhere. Everything in the Bible was about love and peace and joy, and suddenly we have this jarring passage. Those passages only jar us because we're not reading the Bible enough. If we were reading the Bible all the time, those passages would not surprise us. Those passages didn't surprise most of the people who were getting them. This was very much in keeping with what we see throughout the Bible, all the way back to the fall being mostly Adam's fault, to going through the nation of Israel, to going through the 12 apostles, to going to the elders. All of this is in keeping with the same story. So when we get into marriage, the two things that I have up here are headship and restraint. And what I want to show is that these two go together. So headship, what I mean by this is the responsibility and leadership that a man has within marriage and within the household. And by restraint, what I mean is the way that that's put into practice is not through tyranny or domination, but through love. So let's just look at a few verses in this. So Ephesians 5:23, which is the verse leading up to the commands to men, but is the commands to women in this great marriage passage, says, "For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior." People, sort of modern theologians, have tried to do all kinds of things to make head not mean authority. You can read, I can recommend books for you, or another Mike Winger video that you can look at if you really want to dig deep and say, is there something to this? At the end of the day, head means what we think it means. It means that there's a level of leadership and authority here. So he says, all right, in the way that marriage is set up, the man is the head. By the way, for guys, and this is something I really think we need to take into consideration. We'll talk about it more in the second part. Men are never commanded to be the head. He doesn't say men be the head. He says, men, you are the head. And you might be a man here and you're like, well, no, I'm not really leading my family. You should start leading your family because you're the head. That's the command in Scripture. So he says this, but then, so that's the command to the women. So he says, all right, wives, submit to your husbands, because the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. Then he says 2 verses later, husbands, make your wives submit to you and make sure they always know that you're the head. Says, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And I'm not going to say, I don't think it would be right to say that there's never any scenario that could exist in which it would be appropriate or wise for a husband to tell his wife, I need you to submit to me. That scenario could exist. What I'd say is that is definitely not the scenario we want to find ourselves in. It's almost like if you got there, you're probably already losing. Like that's not a good place for us to be. And there's no passage in Scripture that ever instructs husbands, hey, make sure your wives are submitting to you. Make sure your wives know who wears the pants in the family. Make sure your wife knows that you're the head. It says, husbands, you love your wives. And this is what I love, this idea of headship. He's not saying abdicate responsibility. He's saying use restraint. And instead of doing it through tyranny, do it through love, which I think has implications outside of marriage, has just implications for leadership in general. There's a time when you're a leader and you sort of have to lay down the law, but that's not how you want to live. You want to live, for the most part, by serving and by leading in a way that make people want to follow your lead. Now, a couple more passages just reinforce this. Colossians 3, and I don't have the full passage up here, but right before this is verse 18, which says, wives, submit to your husbands. Here's the instruction to husbands. Husbands, once again, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. So he's not saying, hey, husbands, you're not in charge. Let the wives be in charge. He's saying, no, you have the weight of responsibility. You're the head. Don't be harsh with your wives. Love your wife. Don't be harsh with her. And another verse that will come up in the second half of this deeper event, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Now, I'm going to bring this passage up later in the event, so I'm not going to talk about this at length right now. But at the beginning, when it says, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, some different translations translate this as, live with your wife in an understanding way. The literal Greek is, live with your wife according to knowledge. Now this, once again, this is after 6 verses where Peter directs his attention to the wives and once again says, wives submit to husbands. So I think sometimes we think this is an either or. We're like, well, we either have to take sort of the more traditional view of headship and submission, or we need to be very positive towards women. Peter doesn't take that choice. He says, no, I'm going to keep the order that God has set up here, but I'm going to tell the husbands, this is the way that it looks when you're taking responsibility. You're taking responsibility to live with your wife in an understanding way. I like to joke that thank God he doesn't say, husbands, understand your wives. He just says, live with them in an understanding way. You're not going to understand them. He's not that crazy to tell us that. But he says, all right, live in an understanding way. This is a beautiful idea that he's talking about this. We'll talk more about this in the second half. He doesn't shy away from headship. He says, no, there's a weight of responsibility. There's a weight of responsibility and leadership on men. This is not just in marriage. This goes all the way back to Adam. This goes all the way back to the nation of Israel. This goes to their religious life and to the way that they went to war. This goes all the way back to the beginnings of the church with 12 apostles who were all men, with elders who were men, and with the men taking responsibility in the church life to set a peaceable tone. So this is totally in keeping with everything else. Men, step forward and take the lead, and men, as you do that, do it with restraint. Don't do it by overpowering. Do it with compassionate love. Now here, let me give you a preview. Some of you have already looked ahead because you read the last comic strip panel before you get to it, and you just want to know where this is going. What we're going to do in the second part of the deeper event is we're going to go over 4 qualities I think Scripture tells us that men are meant to cultivate. And most of them are going to be based on some passages that we've already gone over and that we're going to build off. So what we'll do now is we're going to go ahead and take a break. Once again, you can hit the bathroom, you can grab another stack, you can just walk around and stretch your legs, and in a few minutes I'll regather us and we'll start going through the second part of this. All right, everybody, you can start to make your way back to your seats. Once again, you can see up on the screen, we have the phone number for the Q&A time. I do love when we do the Q&A time. It's an opportunity, first of all, it's an opportunity to get more clarity. And also, I know for me, the way that I structure this is that there are certain things that I assume everybody wants to hear about. But the Q&A time lets me know that there are things that didn't occur to me that somebody's saying, I want to know more about this. So take your time on that. We will leave about 20 to 25 minutes at the end to be able to do the question and answer time. It's always a good opportunity. So when you text those in, those just go to the guys in the back and they'll make slides for those. And the reason we do that instead of sort of the live Q&A is just so that we can have the opportunity for everybody to see the questions and to be able to organize them. So here's what we're doing for the second, for part 2 of this deeper event. We're going to be talking about 4 qualities that men can cultivate. And as we went through this first half, again, the first half, hopefully a lot of what you picked up is that, all right, there's a thread throughout all of Scripture. And that thread throughout all of Scripture is that there is a unique calling for men in the world, in the church, in the family, and a lot that's involved in that is stepping forward into positive roles of taking responsibility and leadership. That doesn't mean that we need to get into the deep minutia of saying in every setting, in all of life, men need to be the ones in charge. We have all kinds of other settings. We have Sunday school classes where there are women taking the lead. Sometimes some of us have occupations where there's a woman who's our supervisor. So we don't have to get so specific that we say, well, in every minute circumstance, there must be a man in charge. But it does mean that in general, what we're looking at is we're looking at God's positive design for men to be willing to step forward and take that initiative. Now, some of you men in here, you are born leaders. Sort of like the way that God made you, it's hard for you not to lead. You get into a small group where you're not the leader, but somehow you become the leader because you just cannot be the leader. So I recognize even when we talk about this, there can be the temptation to sort of say, well, the guys get to do the cool thing. The guys get to step forward and they get to be the leader. And for some of you in this, you probably are like, I'm glad. For a lot of us as guys, this is very daunting. Having the weight of responsibility can be exciting, but there are also a whole bunch of us that sort of shy away from this. So the reason I bring this up is just to say, this is both good and bad. For some guys, it's like, yes, I get to be in charge. I love that. For some of us guys, we're like, no, like, do I have to? Do I really have to wear that weight of responsibility? I remember talking to Gary a lot as we were getting ready for the pastoral transition this last year. We do every spring, we do this pastor, we didn't used to call it a retreat because Gary used to call it a retreat, but we all complained and said it's not a retreat, we work the whole time. So we started calling it the planning summit. And this year, because we were sort of in the middle of the handoff, Gary had me take the lead with that. And I told him I think it was on the first full day of the summit, I just came up to him while we were taking a break in the planning and I said, I used to be way more relaxed at these things in the past. It was like I was a full participant, but when there were breaks, I was just kind of going off to the side. And Gary just said, I'm relaxed. So, fair enough. But so part of what, I said at the beginning, we want to look at this. This is going to be the same with womanhood, but with manhood, we want to say, all right, it's an identity, but there also is an aspiration. So there's an appropriate sense for us as men to say, what do we cultivate if we look to be appropriately masculine, appropriately manly in the best possible way and bring our contribution? And so we'll talk about 4 qualities to cultivate. The first one is sort of courage/strength. And I'll bring up a couple passages to show why I'm putting the 2 of these together. One of the passages is 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 13. And this comes as Paul is winding down the chapter and winding down this book. I'll read the passage, but then I'll show you why I wanted to highlight this one. He gives these rapid fire commands. He says, be on your guard, stand firm, be courageous, be strong. And of the 4 commands, the one I want to highlight, it's underlined for you, is be courageous. Now, this is the NIV, which is the main translation we use here, but I just want to put up 3 other translations of what it says for that one command, be courageous. English Standard Version, act like men. New American Standard Version, act like men. I love the King James Version, quit you like men, which just means act like men. And if you go back in the Greek word, that's really literally what it means. Don't get too caught up in the KJV. I put it up there. If you're like, what does it mean to quit? It basically means acquit yourself like a man. The whole reason I put this up here is because Paul uses a word to say, act like men. And the way that the word ends up getting translated is be courageous, which is a good translation of it. In fact, there's a verse in the Old Testament, and I couldn't resist putting this up. There's a verse in the Old Testament where men are told to act like men. And it's actually the Philistines talking to each other in 1 Samuel. So it's 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 9. What happens here is that the Israelites are going out to battle against the Philistines. They've lost a previous battle, but now they bring the Ark of the Covenant out. And they say, we're going to take the Ark of the Covenant to battle with us, and we will definitely win. The Philistines hear them all celebrating, and they get scared. They say, no, they've got the Ark with them. But then they say, be strong, Philistines, be men. And it's funny because it comes from the Philistines, but it's this same idea. When they're saying be men, they're not saying be male. They're saying act like men, be courageous, and go out to battle. There's different kinds of courage that men and women both practice. Men are called to be brave, women are called to be brave, but there's a special call for men to bring strength and courage to the table. Now, I want to talk about this for a little while. So first of all, we can say, all right, if we're called to be strong, if men are called to be strong, how does that play into our physicality? And what I want to say is our physicality is not the main part of this, but it's not a part we should shrug off totally. Now, some of you know a little bit of the story, but my dad has been in a wheelchair for the last 35 years. And so he was physically capable, and then suddenly he was very not physically capable in many ways. He still is able to do some basic things, but a lot of his physical strength was taken away from that. When that happened to my dad, he was not robbed of his ability to be manly. He was not robbed of his ability to be courageous, and he wasn't robbed of his ability to be strong. But there is a real loss there at the same time. There's a real loss of certain things that he could no longer do that men typically are able to bring to the table in terms of physical strength. It's good to have men that, as much as we can, we have some physical capability. We have the ability to dig ditches. We have the ability to bring protection. We have the ability to lift heavy things. I joke sometimes with Karina when she asks me to open something, like open a jar. I'm like, this is why you have me. Like, this is why it's a good thing I can do this. That there's something positive about us being able to bring that physicality. So the whole application of this is not like, hey guys, we got to all hit the gym. We got to all have massive muscles. And at the same time, that there is something that we should look at and say, well, that's not something just to set completely to the side either. There's something that's very positive about having some physical strength. But beyond that, I'd say, all right, even physical strength is not the main thing, because what he's saying in these passages is not men be physically strong. The assumption is that, relatively speaking, men are capable of physical strength in a way that God has made us as being more physically strong than the average woman. But the main thing that he's saying here is be courageous. Be willing to use your strength in a courageous way. Be willing to fight. Now, we live in a culture, and in many ways we should be very thankful for this. Most of us are not living in situations where we constantly need to be ready to fight. There's a lot of settings that we could be dropped into where that would be necessary, and there's even other settings in the United States where that would be much more necessary. I sort of have thought at different times where I'm like, well, I've never done anything violent. You know how you say things to kind of make yourself feel like you're a good person? You're like, I've never done anything violent to someone else. And I'm like, well, when was I in a situation where that was a big temptation or a big need, where I was like, I'm going to go get revenge on this person, or I'm going to go take this rival person out? Most of us, thankfully, have not been in situations where that's constantly required of us or we're constantly tempted by it. And at the same time, as men, we should be ready and we should be willing if the occasion should come for that. For a lot of cultures in human history, it's just been normal. Every man goes into the military for a certain time period. There's a part of me, when I think back on my life, I'm like, I'm glad I didn't have to do that. Then there's also a part of me that says, would I be a better man if I had had to do that? Like that wouldn't have been bad for me if I had to do that and develop some of that. So the whole idea here is that we should be willing to fight. We should be willing to risk for all of this. When we think of qualities that we want in men, there's a lot of ways that we could put this. But what I want to say is there's one quality of men we definitely don't want. There's one adjective for men that we absolutely should not want. This is true for all of us as men. If you're a parent and you have sons, you do not want this adjective for your sons. Are you ready for the adjective? Harmless. We do not want harmless men. You know what harmless equals? Harmless equals useless. We don't want a bunch of brawlers. We don't want a bunch of men that are always picking a fight physically or verbally, but we don't want men who are harmless. We want men who are willing to draw a line. We want men who are willing to be brave. We want men who are willing to fight physically. Hopefully that won't happen. But at the very least, that we're willing to draw a line and we're willing to do battle over what is most important. We do not want a bunch of harmless, useless men. We want men who are brave and who are willing to fight. And as a warning on this, I think one of the reasons why, maybe even for some of you, you're like, I feel like we need some more harmless men, because there is domestic violence and that there's all kinds of things, all kinds of ways that men get this wrong. And you're right, there's all kinds of ways that men get this wrong. But when we think about this, one of the ways that ends up getting perverted is for us as men, instead of being willing to fight on behalf of the people entrusted to us, we end up fighting the people entrusted to us. Instead of being willing to stand up and protect our wives, we end up being abusive to our wives. Instead of being willing to stand up and protect and advocate for the employees who are under us, we end up just verbally abusing the employees under us because we need somebody to beat up on. So the whole idea, it's sort of like strength is scary in some ways. We're like, can't we just tone down that strength? Can't we just tone down that a little bit? We actually don't want to tone this down. We want to redirect it. Men need to be willing to fight. Men need to be willing to stand up for things. We do not want harmless men. Harmless men are useless men. We want men ready to fight, but restrained and self-controlled enough that we don't have to fight, and that we're able to fight in wise ways. So we want to develop courage. We want to develop strength. Men, as we think about this, we do want to have in our minds, what would I do? What am I willing to stand up for? What am I willing to go to battle for? How am I willing to speak to my boss? Where is my line where I'm going to say, no, I'm not going to do this? We need to be willing to fight. We need to be willing to stand up. And again, the primary idea is not stand up for yourself, although there are times where that's an appropriate way of standing up for what's right. We are called to be courageous. And God uses that courage in profound ways. And frankly, sometimes the biggest way as men that we use our courage is just being willing to step forward and take leadership within the spiritual life of our family. For some of you men, you would rather be in a fist fight than leading prayer with your family because it's that scary and you feel that inadequate. We'll talk more about this actually in the second quality that I want to talk about that we try to cultivate, and that's leadership and responsibility. And in many ways, this should come as no surprise. This flows right out of everything that we covered in the first session here. It's not that there's not a leadership role for women, but there's this primary calling for men to step forward and take the role of leadership. This goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. This goes all the way back to the creation of the man and woman. And I'll flow out of this. This is said to both the man and the woman. It says, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. So this once again, this is for all people. This is for men and women created in God's image. We are meant to subdue the earth. We are meant to rule. We're meant to take leadership and responsibility. But the fact that in the fallout of the sin of the man and the woman, man has primary responsibility, you could say, well, it seems like even in this, that there's a little bit of primary responsibility for the man in this, that we're meant to take leadership, we're meant to take responsibility. And here, it's meant to be for the good of everyone. It's not meant to be that men take the lead and everybody else just has to get in line. It's meant to be the good for all creation that the earth is subdued. Then we move into some things that we already talked about a little bit. We already had the Ephesians verse that talked about within marriage, the husband being the head of the wife. And then we get in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. These are both passages that we went over in the month of January. In the call to parents is actually a call to fathers, which isn't just a euphemism for parents, because a couple verses earlier, there's a separate Greek word that Paul uses to address parents. So Ephesians 6:4, when it talks about don't exasperate your children and instead bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord, it's not that there's no calling to mothers within that. It's that Paul is assuming the core responsibility for that is on fathers. The fathers are taking the lead within the family, and so they're the primary ones looking to find ways to make all of this happen. So as we're looking to do this as men, as we're looking to step forward in this as men, there's an appropriate sense in where we look at these situations, in particular with marriage and parenting, and we say, whether or not I'm a born leader, whether or not I really feel like I crave being in charge or having the responsibility in this, God has said that I do. And one of the great truths of the whole Bible, in every situation we find ourselves in, is God doesn't call anyone to do something that God doesn't end up equipping them for. I don't know if there's any man in here that feels like spiritually leading my family, no problem. That is not how most of us feel. That is not, by the way, if you're a guy in here and you're thinking about that, that is not the way that the elders of this church feel. We regularly pray for each other on this, but we don't approach it and say, no problem, got this down. It is one of the most daunting responsibilities we're given. And so here's part of the encouragement that I want to give right now. I have encountered a lot of men that when we talk about this calling, when we talk about the calling of, all right, within marriage, take the responsibility for the spiritual tone in your home. With the raising of children, take the primary responsibility to put Jesus before them. I've talked to a lot of men that it's not that they don't want to do this, but they feel so daunted by it that they're unwilling to start. You may not know what to do right now. But guys, there's probably a lot of times in our life where we've encountered something where we haven't known what to do, but it's important enough that we figured out what to do. We figured out how to fix it. We watched a YouTube video on how to repair something. We got a mentor that showed us how to do something. We had somebody that teach us how to drive a certain truck. We've all encountered situations where there was something too much for us, and we said, this is too much for me. But then, God willing, we pushed through, we figured out a next step, we got some help, and we ended up pushing through because we needed to do it. So if you're sitting here right now and you're like, I guess I'm called to lead my family, but I don't know how to do it, don't stop at, I don't know how to do it. Take a next step. Say, I don't know how to do it, so what's my next step to figure out? Is it that I need to read a book? Is it that I need to watch some YouTube videos? Is it that I need to talk to a pastor? Do I need to talk to another man in the church that I see that I'm like, gosh, he really seems to be leaning in and looking to live this out, and I need to get some tips and some ideas here. Don't get frozen. Figure out a next step. And I'll just say, if any of you guys are like, I want to do that, I literally can't figure out what I should do first, come talk to me afterwards. I don't remotely have all the answers. I'll help you just get started. I'll just say, all right, here's the first thing you can do. You're going to meet up with this person. We're going to do this. Watch this video. Read this book. This will just get you on the road to get started. So if you're hearing this and you're like, gosh, all right, it seems to be in the Bible I'm supposed to do this, don't get frozen by the fact that you are not up to the task now. If God has called you to do this, God will equip you to do this. And guys, our families need us. Our families need us to step forward in this. Our kids need us to step forward in this. One more word on this before moving on. And that's just that some of you may be listening to this and you're like, you may genuinely feel like I blew it. Like my kids are grown. I didn't really do this. I missed my opportunity. You may have missed some opportunities, and there may be some real grief and maybe some repentance to have over missed opportunities. All of us have that. God is not finished with you, and God loves to redeem things that were missed. God may have a unique role for you right now in your grandchildren. God might have some healing and reconciliation with your adult children. God has all kinds of things for you. So what I'm not saying is sometimes we just ignore the fact that we do have regrets. I never understand the people that say I have no regrets. That's very confusing to me when somebody says I have no regrets. I'm like, do you have no conscience either? I'm like, I have so many regrets. My goodness. It's okay to say there are genuine regrets. You don't have to pretend that the regrets aren't there. God's not done with you. God still has something for you in this. So don't get frozen by past regrets and miss out on what God has ahead for you. This also just means that all kinds of opportunities for us in our young men to affirm competency and leadership and stepping forward courageously are really valuable. This goes for both courage and this goes for the leadership and responsibility. Now this can go for dads, but I'll just say a word to moms, especially moms of boys. It is very valuable if you can do things that affirm that your sons, as young men, have something unique to bring to the table. And it can be as simple as saying, can you carry this for me? This is sort of heavy. You can feel like, well, that's kind of manipulative. No, it's not. That is, as a young man communicating, you bring strength to the table, and I want you to know that that's something valuable that you bring to the table. It can be as simple as something like that, and it can be affirming when the sons take brave steps to get out of their comfort zone. And that could be socially, that could be academically, that could be in all sorts of different ways. Affirming this, there's something powerful. I know I'm talking a lot about we as men taking the lead on this. Moms, there is such a powerful role when moms affirm this in their sons. So I just wanted to say a word on that. All right, quality number 3 that we'll talk about is respectability. And here's why I wanted to talk about respectability. Because there are passages in the Bible that affirm the idea that this is what men are craving, specifically from their wives. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 33, when it sums up all of the content on marriage, and now marriage is this beautiful illustration of Christ in the church, it says, all right, and husbands, you go ahead and love your wives and see that the wife respects her husband. I talked about this several weeks ago. There's a great book by Egerson Emmerich called Love and Respect, one of my favorite marriage books. I think it's really, really helpful, talking about how women crave love and we men need to give that, and men crave respect and the wives need to give that. It's a very, very helpful book. It seems to point at the idea that respect is something that we as men deeply crave. And in all the conversations I've had with men over the year, this has been reinforced again and again and again. This is what we crave. And then we get to 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2. I already quoted this a little bit earlier. It's a qualification for elders. And you can see in all the different things listed, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable. Now, here's why I wanted to bring this up. If respect is somewhere at the core of what a man is longing for, longing to get, than men, it makes a lot of sense that we would look to live in a way that is respectable. Now, just as a husband can love a wife who's not being very lovely at the moment, a wife can respect a husband who's not being very respectable at the moment. So we'll put that on the table. That absolutely is true. With that said, guys, we don't want to make it difficult. You don't want to make it difficult for your wife. You don't want to make it difficult for your kids. You don't want to make it difficult for your employees or your friends. You want to live in a way that respect is sort of a natural thing that is coming your way. And one of the main ways that I think that this comes across is that we need to make sure, that there's a different way that this applies to women, but as men, we need to make sure that we are casting off boyhood and embracing adulthood at the appropriate time. As a culture, we worship youth and we try to hold on to youth. I hope that I'm here when I'm still really old, because I'm going to get like everything I've ever said about old people thrown back at me when that happens. I know that's coming. I know I harass people about age. I do it for two reasons. The first reason is I do it to be funny, because it's funny. And I just like to joke around. But the second reason I do it actually does have a little bit of substance to it. The second reason I do it is because I want us to get away from this idea of thinking that getting older and acting like a full adult is something that we need to resist. I hate, though, I've joked about the whole, I'm 71 years young. No, you're not. If you're 71, you're old. And I say that and people are like, that is not an insult. Being old is not an insult. Being old is an age. Age is just a number. Yeah, and some numbers are really old. Like, it's okay. We don't need, we're so like, how could you say that about a person? My kids all know that I'm old. They talk regularly about how I'm old now. This is all okay. And here's why I want to say this, especially with us as men. We need to, there's probably an appropriate boyish quality that's always going to be part of us no matter how old we are. We need to not be holding on to irresponsible boyishness. When you read in the New Testament and Paul is talking to Timothy about setting aside youthful lusts, even outside of the area of sin and sort of flippancy and lack of self-control, we need to be willing to act like we're full adults. People talk about, and I know people talk about this with women also. They talk about mom jeans and stuff like that. They'll talk about dad bod and sort of dad jeans and things like that. Or, you're dressing like a grandpa. Hey, if you're a grandpa, dress like a grandpa. I can't wait to be a grandpa. I'm going to dress like a grandpa. I don't know what that means. Bill, what does that mean? So here's our, but even in all seriousness, we should be thinking about this in the way that we dress. We should be thinking about this in the way that we talk. It's not that it's okay when you're a young man to be using foul language, but there's something about it happening as you get older that it's like, this is just kind of pathetic. Like, all right, you expect a lower threshold of self-control when you're younger, for all of us. And as we get older, there's a bigger expectation. If we're still talking with foul language as we're getting older, it's not appropriate. It's not that it's appropriate when you're 17, but it's much less appropriate as you get older. And it certainly is not respectable. We should be thinking about this in the way that we spend. If we are adult men and we are unable to sort of get our spending under control and not constantly be buying toys that are putting our family in a financial problem, then we're not acting like very respectable men. If we are unwilling to take care of ourselves physically, I know almost no man wants to go see the doctor. Almost no man. Like, I get it. I went to the dentist for the first time in like 6 years earlier this year, so I'm not a great example on this. Karina's like, yep. She got to the point that she stopped reminding me. She was like, if he's going to do it, he's going to do it. We are respectable when we take responsibility for our own health, and especially if you're married, not put your wife in a situation where suddenly you're going to die of something that was fully preventable if you would have taken responsibility and just been a respectable man who is willing to do that. There are certain ways. If we want respect, we should act in a way that's easy for people to respect. And just a final word on this, and this is to all of us, but in some ways this is to the women in the room. Like I said, in this church, I'm very thankful. The tone in our church is not that men are constantly being ripped on. And And that's good because sort of in the culture at large, that's a lot of what you get in different pop culture ideas. When you're watching TV shows and sort of even watching news shows, you get a lot of that. And that would wear on anyone. And one of the things that's happened as a result of this is there sort of is this men's movement. You find a lot of it on YouTube where there are these guys, some of them might be doing it under a Christian label, but most of them are not, where they're sort of pushing back against this and advocating for here are all the ways. If you're saying who needs men, I'm going to tell you who needs men. You need men because we're your police officers and we're your military, and they're bringing up all of these things. And it's not that they're wrong. A lot of the things that they're saying are actually correct contributions that men have to the world. But here's the deal. Just so you know, when we as men get to the point that we have to prove why we should be respected, we've already lost the game. For women, and I promise when I'm saying this, I'm not making fun of you ladies. I don't want it to come across that at all. You want to be told by your husband, I love you. But if you tell your husband, I need you to tell me that you love me, and then your husband says, I love you, what's the next thing you say? Yeah, you say it doesn't count, which frustrates us as husbands, but I think we can understand it. We're like, all right, like fair enough. If we need to be told, hey, please say I love you. All right, I love you. You're like, all right, well, that's fine. Now say it when I haven't cued you for it. There's a parallel to this for us as men. If we're out there and we're like, hey, we're going to demand respect, we've already lost the game. We want to act in a way that's respectable, and women just, again, the power that the respect of a good woman gives to a man is hard to quantify. So the power that you have to build up your man, the men that you put in your life is amazing. All right, last thing that we'll talk about before we take the break and move to the Q&A is gentleness. And I wanted to hit this because this might be the unexpected one on the list. That we think, all right, well, I'm supposed to be brave, I'm supposed to be strong, I'm supposed to be courageous, and I'm supposed to be gentle. Yes, in the right way. We already talked about 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8. This has the idea of restraint. All right, as a man, you're ready to fight. That's good. You should be ready to fight. You should be ready to fight for what's important, but you shouldn't be fighting one another, and you shouldn't let fighting get in the way of what God has called you to do in the unity that he's called you to as a church family. And then we also talked about 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 7. It's great, verse 2, husbands. In the middle of this verse, I didn't highlight this the first time, it talks about treating your wife with respect as the weaker partner, which once again feels very non-PC in our culture right now. People try to figure out, what does Paul mean by the weaker partner? And some people just go right to physicality, which kind of makes sense to say, all right, on the whole, in like 99% of cases, the wife is going to be more physically fragile than the husband. And so some people think that Peter might have even been going for trying to combat spousal abuse in this, which it's not impossible that that's one of the implications he has in mind. But I think just in general, even beyond the physicality, he's pointing towards the idea that there's a delicacy to women that's not quite the same as men. As men, when we get together, there's a lot of making fun of each other that typically goes on. And if you're a man and you're sensitive to that, it's kind of hard for you. Like, you want to be able to embrace that as that's kind of how guys are with each other. You kind of rip on each other. John and I and a couple other guys, we made up a disc golf course here at the church during the shutdown when we were all losing our minds and we just needed to do something that was fun. So usually at least once a week, we go out and we just play to finish up a day. And when we do, there's a lot of laughing at each other. Like, there's a lot. And it's good-natured. We all know we love each other. We all know we're friends. But that's sort of how guys interact. Guys, if you've been married even for a little while, you realize that doesn't work well with your wife. Like, that is the way that we talk as guys, that's not good to try to translate that over. There's a fragility, appropriately. We want that. There's a sensitivity that's a beautiful contribution to the world. So what Peter's going for overall is saying there's an appropriate gentleness, and guys, the best target for that gentleness is the women in our lives. It is manly to be gentle with women. It is manly to be protective towards women, and not just to be protective in the sense of physicality, like I'm willing to take somebody on if he's going to put my wife in danger. Although I do want to say again, that should be something in our minds. If you're walking down the street and there's somebody that you're like, I don't know what's going on here, it's good for you to get between that person and your wife just in case. If you're in bed and you hear a noise downstairs, you don't say, honey, go check that out. You go check that out. It's usually going to be nothing or somebody left something open, but there's something positive in all of that. But there's also something very positive in us as men, in sort of our brutishness, figuring out what it looks like to be sensitive to women in general, and specifically if we're married to the wife that God has given us. And to say, all right, how do I sort of tame this brute part of myself and find a way to be gentle towards my wife? That is not getting in touch with your feminine side. That is you being manly. That is you being appropriately masculine and bringing something under control for the good of other people. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pause there, and we'll take another break just for a minute. Once again, the text questions phone number is up there. Hopefully some of you have already texted those in. If you have questions, go ahead and text those in. We'll take about another 5-minute break, get up, hit the restroom, grab something to eat, and then we'll come back together and we'll go through the last segment. All right, as we get ready for the last section, you can go ahead and make your way back to your seats. As we get ready to finish up the night, I do just want to do a couple thank yous for those who helped us make this happen. So I don't know where everybody is. Where's Barb? Somewhere in there. Barb over there is standing. Thank you so much. She helped organize all of this. Christine, who's in the back, helped us out too. Bree is right there, not wanting to wave her hand. Bree helped out. And then Ryan and Ty have been in the back helping us with tech and helping us with video. I know there were others who helped out too, and so I'm sorry if I didn't remember you. Your reward will be in heaven instead of right here, because I didn't, the rest of you got your reward in full right there. But we'll go through these questions. Ty, thankfully, is typing them all up as they come in, and we'll just walk through. I think we'll be able to get through all of them. Whoa, Ty and I were at cross purposes. There we go. All right. What are your thoughts on the objective of our present culture leaning in gender and the potential results? And Karina and I talk about this from time to time. There are different things in culture that I think we sort of assume the trajectory we're on we'll just continue on that same trajectory. And we may. I just feel like we're already coming to some pretty strong pushback on a lot of the gender stuff that we've been doing. I think part of it comes down to when kids are involved, parents get very ferocious, appropriately so. So I think that we have a culture that sort of prizes the live and let live. And so it's like, all right, if this man wants to dress up as a drag queen, fine. And we sort of have that attitude. But then when something comes to our kids, we're like, whoa, back off. Stop indoctrinating my kids. Don't put my kids in danger. And especially when we end up in situations where schools are sort of at odds with parents. Quick thing, and this was not the fault really of my son's school. It's the fault of policy. But during the COVID shutdown, our oldest son was in high school. He was a freshman. No, he would have been a sophomore when we did this. Everything was at home. They weren't going into class at all. It was October of 2020. And so we all went to Zion National Park. We were just like, fine, he'll check in the morning, but we'll have him take some days off school. We'll go and we'll hike around there. It was wonderful. We got back and he had been marked with unexcused absences, which we were confused. We were like, well, no, we called in. We excused him. We went on this trip. And they were like, yeah, you can't do that. And I just in my head got so ferocious because I was like, the school is trying to protect my kid from me. Now that was just for an unexcused absence. So I can imagine a parent just feeling like my school is telling my kid not to talk to me about the fact that they want to go on hormones. So I say that just to say, I think that we're seeing a lot of strong pushback. Part of the challenge in this is that the pushback is not always ultimately as helpful as it could be. So we have this flattening of the culture, sort of like there's no definition of a man, no definition of a woman. You can sort of make yourself into anything that you want to be. And then we have people, not always Christian people, but people pushing back on this because they see that it's ridiculous. They see that it's foolishness and they see that it's leading into confusion. But sometimes all that they have to push back on is sort of this maybe extreme sense that we have of masculinity and femininity, and maybe they're getting part of it right, but part of it wrong, or the stuff that's right, there still is no real anchor to it, and maybe things are being said like guys need to be this way, but it's not the best of us, and suddenly it's like, nah, yeah, guys do need to sleep around, and there's a conquest idea. So I'd say I think that we're already seeing like we're not just heading on the same trajectory, there's already a lot of pushback. I think we as the Church of Jesus Christ need to be able to communicate what we have to offer our culture on an area where we are deeply confused. We have an opportunity here. And this is why there are some subjects, and I'm in a legacy here at this church where I'm not starting something new. That part of the legacy of this church is that we talk about everything in the Bible. We don't apologize for it. We talk about it plainly. And there are times that people will sort of act like, wow, like that's a big deal. Like, are you sure you want to take on these subjects? Are you sure you guys want to talk about these things that are cultural hot buttons? And I just think if we don't say something on this, we are leaving it to all the people who either have a nefarious agenda or maybe are sort of trying to point in the right direction but have no anchor in Scripture. They just have an anchor in sort of biological evolution or general common grace. So I don't know where it's all going to go. What I do think, and you all are going to have to decide the wisest way to navigate this. I think that at the very least, we should all stop saying things that we believe to be untrue. And I hope what I'm saying there makes sense. There are things to sort of just get along, to sort of go along to get along in our culture that we're expected to say that are untrue. Even down to the idea of calling Caitlyn Jenner a she. I'm bringing this up just to say it's a bad habit to get into when we start saying things that we know we don't believe. So that doesn't mean that we have to be brawlers. There's a time and a place, and there's gentleness for us to mix in this, but I think at the very least, we need to stop saying things that we don't think are true, and we need to not be embarrassed to say things that God has revealed are true. One of the things I recognize whenever we talk about marriage, today we talk to some degree on, submission and headship. I'm not blind to the fact that in our culture, and even within our church culture, there's probably like, we're not all totally comfortable with this. I recognize that's the case. One of the reasons why I want to talk about it maybe more these days is because I want to normalize us just not getting shocked by what the Bible says. I want us just to be used to it. I want us to believe that the Bible's guidance for us makes more sense than the world's guidance for us. So I think that that's very important for all of us, to not sort of look at ourselves and say we're weird. In our culture, we are weird. We're a peculiar people. We're strangers. We're exiles here. In God's economy, in God's way of viewing things, we are not the weird ones on this. It doesn't mean we need to call names. It doesn't mean that we have to be cruel to other people. It just means we need to stop acting like we need to apologize because we're really weird and old-fashioned on this. We're not weird and old-fashioned on this. We are holding up God's truth. And especially for raising children right now, if we are not actively talking about these things, the flow of the culture is not going to lead in a good direction. So we need to be proactive about it. Second question. How should the rendering of the Greek word malakoi as effeminate in 1 Corinthians 6:9 affect how we understand biblical manhood, its severity, and what would be the application of faithfulness to repenting of malakoi or avoiding such behavior? So this is a little technical. So just to get everybody up to speed, there's two words that are used in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9, that seem to be connected with the act of homosexuality, like homosexual male, the sex act. And it's translated in different ways. As it says, sometimes it's translated as effeminate in one of them, and then the next one might be translated more as homosexual. Sometimes they combine the words. The best scholarship that I've read on this seems to indicate that what's going on, Paul is using two different words, and I apologize if this feels a little bit, I'm not meaning to be graphic, but to describe the active and the passive partner in male homosexual activity. So to be kind of crass, the giver and the receiver in male homosexual activity. So I think that's probably what's going on there. And so when the word effeminate is sometimes used, it's sort of broadly speaking an appropriate word for that. But it's not just describing general effeminacy. It's talking specifically about that being played out in the homosexual act. Now, I think within this, if we're looking for a broader application and saying, all right, as men, are there certain sort of effeminate qualities that we should look to not practice? Are there certain things that we're talking about in terms of the way that we dress and the way that we talk and the way that we act that we should be looking to avoid? And what I'd say is maybe, I think what we certainly want to do is we want to act in a way that's recognizable as men. And that's not confusing, where it's like that's kind of a way that a woman acts. I know some of you guys wear pink. That's culturally okay now. I'm confused. I feel like there are people in our culture that are like on a crusade. Men should wear pink. And I'm sort of like, why can't there just be one color we men don't wear? I just don't see a problem with it. But it's like, all right, there might have been a time some years ago where it's like, all right, to wear pink would have felt kind of like, that's weird. It's not weird anymore. It's weird to me, but I'm weird. I don't know. I'm just like, yeah, I'm not going to do it. Phil's always like, it's salmon. It's not pink. And I'm like, I don't know. It looks real pink to me. But here's the point that I'm making in this. The point that I'm making in this is that does not, if you're a guy and you're wearing a pink shirt, it does not communicate to somebody that you're trying to be an effeminate man. But at one point, it might have communicated that. So I do think we can look at it and say, all right, am I talking or acting or behaving in a way that people around would say, it kind of seems like he's acting like a girl. And it kind of seems like he's not aware that he's acting like a girl. If you have guy friends, they usually help you with this. Like you get past that real quick. You're like, oh, okay, I don't want to do that again. Which is not always great, but sometimes is actually helpful that you're like, oh, I didn't realize that was kind of an awkward way that I was behaving. The heart of this, that I think for us as men, and for any of us who are involved in sort of the raising or the training of men, is just to say, we are looking to behave in a way that is recognizable as men that we have embraced masculinity in a positive way, and not that we're confused about that. Some men are going to have higher voices and deeper voices, and some men are going to be stockier, and some men are going to be thinner. That's all peripheral to this conversation. All right, next question. What are ways that women can be supportive to their husbands as headship? I just want to say, I love this question. What a beautiful question. That there's many things. In fact, we just I recorded a 2-part podcast episode with Lauren Van Woudenberg and also Summer Brown, our women's ministry pastor, and we talked about several questions. I would encourage you. We released the first one. I think it's this next Wednesday that we'll release the second part of that because it ended up in a long conversation. So I'd say go listen to those. There is some really helpful advice in those. One of the things that I would just say is if you're a wife and you see your husband looking to take maybe clumsy steps to spiritual leadership, where you're like, okay, I see what he's trying to do. It's not great, but you see that he's trying to do it. Your encouragement in him doing that, you're just, hey, thank you so much for doing that. It can be as simple as prayer. There was a guy, he and his wife have since moved away, but his whole ministry at this church was trying to get guys to pray with their wives because he experienced so much of guys just being so terrified to do this. I'm going to say something stupid. I'm going to look foolish in front of her. Men do not want to look foolish in front of their wives. So if your husband decides, I'm going to pray at the dinner table, and to him, that might feel like a heroic, risky step of looking to take the spiritual responsibility in the family. If he says something weird or clunky or it's not the best prayer, please encourage him in that. If you feel like a conversation afterwards where you'd be like, you said something that actually wasn't true, okay, maybe you can do that. But please look to build up any effort that he makes. So for us as men, we're typically not complicated creatures. We will typically repeat what we get rewarded for. It's like we're simple people. It's like, that went well. I want more of that. I'll go ahead and keep doing that then. So I'd say you can certainly encourage your man in that way. And then I'd also say, if there are ways that you want to suggest ways for him to take the lead that are positive, that can be really wonderful. It doesn't typically work really well if the wife says, you need to step up and do this. What can work really well, though, So if a wife says, I've been thinking about, or, it could be something just between the two of you. If you're saying, it's really been on my heart that we would read a book together. And there's a couple that I found, would you be willing to look at them and maybe decide if there's one of them that we should read together? Or I've been thinking of doing a Bible reading plan, or maybe we should read the Bible together. Would you be willing to decide on a book for us to read together? You can cue him up to make a strong decision. In fact, one of the suggestions that Summer gave, I don't know if it was in the first episode, I think it was in the first episode that we already released, is she talked about encouraging the husband just to decide at the dinner table who prays. That doesn't even have to be him doing it. She suggested have the husband decide which service you go to or where you sit at church. Simple things like that can be very wonderful ways of reinforcing this. But I would just say an attitude, a spirit of respect. If you can communicate admiration in anything he's doing, you just don't underestimate how far that goes. That's such a powerful thing to us as men. And thank you to whoever asked the question, because at this church, we want the spirit of men asking the question, how can I better love my wife? And wives asking the question, how can I better support my husband? We want that happening in small groups and personal conversations and men's Bible study, women's Bible study, all over the place. All right, besides lifting him up in prayer, how can I help or support my adult son, married with 2 babies, to be the spiritual leader in his home? He would be much more comfortable to have his wife in that role. Yeah, you already mentioned prayer, a lot of prayer. If this is a dad, I would say there might be some more things that you could do. If it's a mom, I would probably just pray. Or encourage your husband to talk to him. And it's not because you might know all the answers. If this is a mom who wrote this, you might see the entire path there. It's probably not going to be helpful for you to come to him and sort of try to encourage him to do something in this if he's already not there, because it's just probably not going to be helpful, even if it should be. If you're a dad and you're in this situation, you're like, I'm wanting to help him do this. I think that there's a greater chance that it could be received, because that's calling him up to positive manhood from another man. You could get together and you could say, like, hey, how about we both start doing this with our families, and then we get together once a month and we talk about how it's going. You could give some paths forward. Sadly, I think that there are a lot of husbands that are willing to just do this right now. Again, we're simple creatures, so sometimes we just take the path of least resistance. And if a husband is like, I'm being let off the hook here, my wife's going to take care of it. And if he's not sort of that born leader type, that he feels that urge to be in charge, he's probably going to see that as a very appealing path. So I would pray. And I know sometimes we say all we can do is pray. Let's not underestimate prayer. All I can do is go to the King of the universe and ask him to do something about it. I wish I could really do something, but all I can do is that. Don't underestimate. We were just talking at the break. A couple of us were talking about a story within our church where just a few years ago there was a husband, probably in his 70s, who came to faith in Jesus after literally decades of his wife regularly praying for him. And it's such an amazing story to see his transformation late in life. So don't underestimate. You may have a young husband who sort of is coasting right now. And maybe what will need to happen is God will need to bring sort of a trial or a challenge into his life that will cause him to step up to it. Maybe there will be something else that happens that God just really gets a hold of his heart. But pray for him. If you're the dad, you might be able to get in there and encourage him in a positive way. But pray, and don't think of prayer as the last resort. Think of prayer as going to battle in behalf of this family. We have spurred on protecting each other's inner child with softer speech, loving childlike gestures, and playful actions. How can I preserve his authority and leadership while building his childlike qualities, safely and vulnerabilities, his innocence? Let me see, is there more there? So I can't quite tell. I think that this might be talking about like a parents with a son. That's how I'm going to answer it. In talking about the idea of things being much more soft and much more gentle. There is a book, I'm trying to make sure I get it right. There's a book that years ago that I read, And then right after I read it, Karina read, which she reads twice as fast as I do. So she was probably done with it before I was done. But it was by Leonard Sachs, who some of you will know that name. I can't think of the name of the book right now. But one of the interesting things that it did was it talked about how boys and girls respond differently to male and female sort of authority figures. It was talking primarily about the teaching realm. And one of the things that it talked about is that young girls, if they have a male teacher, frequently feel like he's yelling at them. And young boys, if they have a female teacher, are frequently seen as sort of like ignoring and being troubling. And what they ended up determining is largely, for a lot of the boys, the reason why they're not doing what the teacher says is because they literally are not hearing what she says. She's being very soft and gentle, and they're literally not registering it. And what they ended up learning was with a lot of the girls, they weren't responding, or that they were feeling yelled at by their teacher, even though when they were observing him, he wasn't actually yelling at them. He was being a man. He was sort of talking in a more commanding voice, but he wasn't being abusive. It was just a different perception of this. So if we're talking about this with boys, one of the things that we both started doing right away, because we have 3 sons, so we're in the fire with all of this, is we started talking to them much more directly. Now they were young at the time, so you'll have to figure out appropriate ways to apply this to different situations. One of the things that I did immediately is I stopped putting a question mark at the end of things I was telling them to do. I realized that we would be at the park, and I would say, okay, in 5 minutes, we're going to leave, okay? Do you hear it? Or like, he can look at it and be like, no, not okay. I'm basically like, you're in charge of this. And I was doing it because it sort of seemed polite. And so I stopped doing that. I said, in 5 minutes, we're going to leave. And he burst. No, this was the shocking thing. Our kids did not burst into tears as if we were talking to them rudely. And I know this was counterintuitive for Karina. Karina had to work harder at doing this. She would give sort of like not even full sentences. She'd be like, trash. And they would just know I'm supposed to go take out the trash. And the kids didn't wilt. They were just like, okay. And they actually could hear her now, and they could hear me. So I do think that there's something, I think we underestimate that we don't need to be rude, but we can speak very plainly to boys, and for the most part, they don't tend to take it as some sort of insulting or degrading thing. We're just getting to the point, which for most of us as guys, we like to do. We're like, bottom line it for me. So I'd say, I think that you probably can cultivate that. I think in your home, if you can cultivate that, one of the ways that this is going to be positive is that for all of us, we don't get more mature except through friction. So if you want a fragile adult man, just constantly be super, super gentle with him. If you want a strong adult man, he's got to experience some friction. So if you want him to be used to somebody talking to him, to a boss one day talking to him and saying, hey, I need this done and I need this done by the end of the day, and him not wilting and crying about how his boss is mean to him, you got to have an appropriate way that you're talking to him about that now. That you're saying, hey, no, I actually need this to get done. And we said we were going to do this. I need you to go and do this. So I think that we can, and I think that many of us are hesitant to do this. We would be surprised at the fact that there's not as much pushback to this as we would think from our sons. Now, if they've been babied until they're teenagers, there's going to be some stuff to overcome. But if they're still young, I think that you could get right on this, and most of them are not going to even notice that you've made the change, other than that they're going to hear you more and actually do the stuff that you say that they should do. What are the ramifications of rejecting these biblical gender roles? How does it damage our marriages, churches, and society? The illustration I've used sometimes for this, and I hope it's helpful, if you've ever been to one of those climbing walls where they have all the handholds and supposed to scale a wall, is that some years ago, we realized that there were some stereotypes of boys and girls that were not helpful, that were actually harmful, that were causing harm, and were sort of too strict. And so we needed to remove some of those handholds to say, no, that's not solid. I joked about the whole, men wearing pink, that we can be like, men wearing pink being bad. We need to take that handhold out. Like, there's nothing in the Bible about that. We'll just remove that because that's not a solid thing to hold on to. And then we just kept going and kept going and kept going. And we kept taking the handholds out. And we were like, no, to be manly, you don't need to go to the gym. No, to be manly, you don't need to do this. No, to be feminine, you don't need to do this. And we removed all the handholds for the wall because we didn't want anybody to grab a hold of a handhold that was going to fall under their weight. So we just took all the handholds off. Then we got all of our young boys and girls together at the foot of the wall, and we said, go ahead and climb it. And it's a smooth wall with no handholds. That is the result of what we've done. We've got a whole bunch of boys and girls trying to figure out how they grow into adulthood, and we're like, you got to figure it out. You literally could just be a boy deciding you're a girl. You got to figure the whole thing out. So I think that is the downside to all of this. And I think even when we talk within marriage, when we talk about submission, I'm not blind to the fact submission is hard. That's hard in any setting. Even if you're a wife with a godly husband, submission is hard. I don't think hey, what's the problem? That's tough stuff. Headship, appropriately biblical headship and love, that's hard. Both of these are difficult things. I don't think one is more difficult than the other. I think both are just very difficult. But I think what they do is they actually give us a structure with which we can function together as a couple. Any two people getting along in a partnership is difficult. Marriage in some ways is more difficult because we're constantly mystified by each other. We're constantly confused because we don't think the same way. If we actually embrace that God is wise, embracing submission and headship within marriage, it doesn't make marriage instantly perfect. You're still two people trying to muddle through with a sinful nature and all of that kind of stuff. And at the same time, it at least puts us on the track for what we're shooting for. It gives us something to call each other and call ourselves both back to. So I think that there maybe were some good-hearted people at the beginning of this that were like, hey, we have some harmful male stereotypes that are harming our boys. We need to take those away. Sure, go for it. We've got some harmful female stereotypes that are harming our girls. We need to take those away. They were right. There were some. Now, every stereotype is a harmful stereotype, and we need to be willing to actually dig into the Bible, say what's real, and we need to be willing to give our kids and ourselves some handholds to actually climb this wall. We need to be in the Bible enough to know what God has called us to. Let's see. I think this might be the last one. What should a man do when he wants some type of physical confrontation? So I'm going to guess that maybe what this is asking is how a man could prepare to be capable in a physical confrontation. Karina and I were actually talking about this the other day. I was just sharing with her. I have not been in settings where I've learned to fight. I know that shocks you all because you look at me and it's something that it would be easy to look at and just sort of be like, well, but I'm in a culture where I don't really need to do it. So that's not a deficiency at all. But I actually do feel like it's a deficiency. I'm like, no, it would be better if I did know some things about how to handle myself. Now, I try to stay in good health. And one of the things, actually, I'm going to ask for a show of hands on this, on guys. Guys, raise your hand if you, on a somewhat regular basis, imagine what you would do if you ended up in a physical altercation with another guy. All right. I regularly do. Now, some of this is just sort of like, it's this weird fantasizing that we do because we want to be the hero. And so, I know what implement I would use in our house if there was an intruder. I have a plan. It's largely a fantasy. I don't know how much it would come to reality. But here's what I do want to say. There's a positive use of that. There's a positive use of us at least thinking through, what would I say, what would I do if this happened? What would I do if while we're walking down the street, somebody does something dangerous, somebody pulls out a gun, somebody says, what will I do in that situation? It doesn't guarantee that you're going to do it, but at least puts you in a position where you've started to think through, started to build that muscle of preparation. And then I do also think, and this, I'm in my 40s now, and I don't have a specific plan on this, but I have kind of thought, it wouldn't be bad for me to do something that taught me at least some basic skills of sort of handling myself if I ended up in a fight. I'm 44. I don't know what the chances are now that that's going to end up happening with me. But those of you men who are in here who have become competent in that, you know that just mentally being competent in that changes the whole way you carry yourself and changes the whole way that you handle yourself in situations. So I don't have these great specific next steps because, to be honest, I haven't really availed myself of this. But I think that there are steps that you can take, and that could be, taking some kind of, basic martial arts class. That could probably be even looking sort of to if you have friends who are police officers and just saying, all right, show me some basic ways that you handle yourself in this. It could be as simple as doing some things like that. I don't know how helpful YouTube videos would be. Probably everybody thinks that they're an expert, and you just get some stuff that anybody who knew what they were talking about would be like, nah, don't do that. But I do think for me, really, the most significant thing within this, and this goes for physical confrontation, and really much more likely the ways that God is going to call us to fight in this culture, much more than physically, most of the time, is going to be with our words and being willing to say what's true, stand up for what's right, and stand up for other people. So I think that they're connected, but I think that we need to be regularly ready as men to say, what are the ways that I'm going to handle a situation when truth is on the line? What is the way that I'm going to handle a situation when somebody is being mistreated? If you're an employer, one of my employees is being mistreated. If you're a teacher, one of the students is being mistreated. To think through those scenarios and be ready to act on those. And then I do think it would be wise for all of us as men to say, all right, I want to become, at least at a basic level, competent in handling myself, because we don't all have mandatory military service that we do that would kind of do that for us. Looks like that's it. All right. Well, thank you for those of you who gave the questions. Those were great, and hopefully those were helpful to lots of you. Thank you to all of you who are here. Again, I don't have a date on it right now, but there will be a second one of these where we'll look to talk through in the same way passages on biblical femininity and look to bring a complement for that. It might seem funny to you to think about a guy getting up here and talking about all that. I think that it's going to be great, and I think that we're going to have a lot of fun getting into it, and I expect to see all of you back there for that one. So thanks so much for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your week.